Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Centre for Excellence in Indigenous Health. The circle is also being co-hosted today by Indigenous Initiatives at the Centre for Teaching, Learning and Technology. I would like to just take a moment to recognize all of their efforts in ensuring that we could have this conversation in this space today. So thank you very much. The team in the room will be acting to facilitate the discussions and questions from you guys, the live audience. So with that, together we're very pleased to welcome back Harley Eagle to continue the conversation we started in September and share the knowledge of cultural safety and leadership. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle. So I would like to remind everyone here today and those participating online that the topics we cover can sometimes be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you're looking after yourself. If you need to talk to like an elder or a friend, a counselor, family member, anybody, please don't hesitate to do so. So, team introductions. My name is Cole. I'm from the Tsawwathil First Nation, and I'll be facilitating the online portion of the discussion today. Other members of the UBC Learning Circle team members in the room today, but off camera, are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Jordy, our assistant coordinator. Members of the CTLT team, would you please introduce yourselves for those of us in the room?
Good morning, everybody. I think I know a lot of you, so it's really nice to see you. My name is Amy Perot, and I'm the strategist for Indigenous Initiatives here at the Centre for Teaching, Learning and Technology.
Hi everyone, I'm Erin Yoon, educational consultant for campus and classroom climate under the Indigenous Initiatives. Nice to meet you all this morning.
Cool. And for those of you on Zoom, if you feel so inclined, please introduce yourselves in the chat box. To kick off the circle, I'd like to give a little bit more information about our speaker, Harley Eagle. Harley is Dakota and Ojibwe and a member of the Whitecap Dakota First Nation. He looks to Indigenous lifeways to guide his work. His experience includes training and consultation in the fields of transforming conflict, anti-racism, dismantling oppression, cultural safety, and trauma healing. He is often invited to speak at conferences, both nationally and internationally. Harley holds a Master's of Arts in Conflict Analysis and Management and currently resides on Vancouver Island. So with that, I'll say welcome back. I'm really excited to dive into the topic, and I'll just let you take it away.
All right, thank you. It's wonderful to be here today with you all again, and thank you for the acknowledgement of the traditional territory. I certainly add mine to that as well. So today I'm going to talk about cultural safety and leadership, and you can see the title of this talk, and really just about everything I want to talk about is in the title, and so I'll work through that today with you all. And the first thing I wanted to say was about change. And really, when we're thinking about this work, when we're thinking about life in general, I mean, the only constant is change in our life. We're constantly changing, as is our working environment, as is the health world, and as is, this what we often call the era of reconciliation that we're presently in. And I know that not everybody is happy with that term and that understanding, but we are talking about change and transformation. And from an Indigenous perspective, that's really the only constant in the world around us, that we are constantly changing and in this mode. So that's something that leaders in this work really need to understand and to grapple with. And I think sometimes the tendency is to try to keep things the same. But in this world where change is always happening, it's important to figure out, so what does that mean? How do I lead in this work when things are constantly changing? So I want to talk a bit about that today. And I heard a good friend of mine say many years ago when I was living on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, he said the hallmark of Indigenous society and worldview was adaptability. skill and the way of recognizing that change was happening, or that new things were coming into your environment, or things were fading away, and how you adapted and how quickly you adapted to that and saw that as useful, the better off you were. So I like to try to remember that's a hallmark of who we are as Indigenous people, as societies that have been around for thousands and thousands of years, is our ability to adapt. And so I just wanted to raise that as well. And then the last thing I wanted to say before moving into the content here was, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as well, that I really feel, one of the primary things I do around cultural safety is facilitate a circle, and not just actually talking circles, which we do a lot of, but also to figure out, what does that mean when I'm not in a circle? How do I walk in this world? And I really feel that that's the role of a leader too, is that our role is to build and to protect and maybe even direct how a circle functions. But really that's all it is that we do. And then we allow for the genius and brilliance of the people within the circle to come forward, and you work with that together with the genius and brilliance that comes up in the middle of the circle as you're sharing your thoughts and exploring things. And so our role then as leaders is to protect that and to allow for the genius and brilliance to come forward. Not that you don't have your things to share as well, but to recognize that that's what your role is, to protect and build and create this environment for change, an environment for transformation, and an environment for creativity and innovation. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today, is what that means to be a facilitator of a circle, even when you're not in a talking circle. So just before I go into the themes too, I also want to recognize the many people in my life that have provided me so much wisdom, so many stories that I've learned from, experiences as I walk in this world, whether it's with my family, my partner and my children and my extended family, or my colleagues, and people that I encounter in so many different places. And we'll talk again about that a little bit later too, about recognizing the need for recognizing that we should be always willing to learn, and knowing that we're on this journey of lifelong learning. And there's so many people that come to mind and a lot of what they have taught me is in what I say. And so I just want to acknowledge all those people, and to name them all would take for the rest of the time for sure. So I just want to acknowledge them, and you know who you are out there. So the main themes that I want to talk about today, and like I said, everything is in the title, so I'll go through some of those items like cultural safety and leadership, what that means from an Indigenous perspective. And then to talk about some of the important qualities that I've noticed that are really helpful in moving this kind of work forward, or engaging in this way that creates a culturally safe environment. And then we have a question. We want to make sure that you folks here in the room and online are able to engage in a meaningful way, and it's not that you only have to think about this question, because you'll obviously have other questions as well. But we wanted to leave a question with you to think about during this time that's been quite prominent in our work over the last 4 years for sure, since the TRC coming to a close and the calls to action being put forward. Many different organizations have attempted to engage with the calls to action. They've found themselves within those calls to action and then enacted some steps. But what we're often hearing is people are somewhat frustrated because they're not sure if any change is happening, or maybe they're stuck in that one way of doing things, and they're wondering, what's next? What else can we do? So we thought that this would be a good question for folks to think about. How have you as a leader, or the leaders within organizations or communities that you are a part of, interacted with the TRC and implemented steps that align with the calls to action? What have the results of these actions been? So just be thinking about that, and at the end of my presentation, I'll bring the question up again. But like I say, you may have other questions as well. So you're not limited to that one question. So I just want to say a little bit about who I am so that you know what I bring to this work and my experiences and my journey. So as was mentioned, I'm Dakota and Ojibwe, originally from Saskatchewan, and actually on my father's side, we're originally from Minnesota in the US. That word is a Dakota word, Minnesota. And back in the 1860s, we talk about the ethnic cleansing of Minnesota when Dakota people were forced out of Minnesota. And so that's how my ancestors ended up in Canada in the 1860s because of that. So I'll jump forward now to my own life. I ended up in British Columbia when I was 16 years old, and I came here with my parents and my younger brother. And I used to say it was because of work for my father. My father was a heavy equipment operator most of his life. He worked in mines and construction and that kind of thing. And he got a job on Vancouver Island at Utah Mines up near Port Hardy. But really it was the reason why we left Saskatchewan was because of the fallout of Indian residential school and reserve life and the chaos that comes from living in that environment of oppression, that historical and intergenerational and systemic oppression that's been enacted on Indigenous people. Both my parents went to residential school and grew up and lived on reserves, and so that environment created chaos within our extended family, and so we really left to get away from the chaos. And so now my own journey is trying to restore some of those connections and to bring back that sense of family, and that's a difficult thing to do, but so very, very important. When I met my partner when I was much younger, about 27 years ago, and she's a very much social justice conscious person, and she was working for an organization that we eventually worked for together that focused on social justice, and it sends people all over the world to work at usually war-torn or poverty-stricken places all over the world, and they send professionals to engage as volunteers there for a number of years. And so after 3 years of marriage, she suggested that we should go on and work for this agency. And so I had learned by then to listen to my partner, and I'm still learning that, and will for the rest of my life, I'm sure. But she said, well, why don't we go work for this organization? And I said, okay, but can we go somewhere where there's people like me? And so we ended up going to Pine Ridge, South Dakota, Pine Ridge Reservation, which is a part of the Dakota Nation. So I went to live and work and be among my own people. And we ended up living there for 7 years. Our children were born there. And that was such a profound time for me, because if you know anything about what they called the Renaissance of Indigenous people, Pine Ridge was central to that. Wounded Knee happened there, and we lived right close by all of that. And we knew many of the people that played roles in that time back in the 60s and 70s. We got to work and live with them and get to know them. And it's a place that's very high in poverty and violence. Unemployment runs around 85–90%. It's a difficult place to live, yet there's this amazing strength of culture, of language, of ceremony, of people knowing who they are in the midst of that struggle. The resilience of the people there was such a wonderful time for me to learn from, and difficult because of all those other reasons, the racism, the continued violation of treaty rights, and all of that kind of stuff was what we lived among. So I learned a lot there. We engaged in anti-racism, and I learned how to become an anti-racism trainer. Eventually I ran an anti-racism program in the U.S. We got involved in understanding treaty violations and treaty rights, and eventually did some work at the United Nations, and that kind of thing, joining with that resistance at the same time as learning about myself and my own culture. And then got involved in conflict resolution, looking to Indigenous ways to deal with conflict, mostly the circle, gathering people together to work together through conflict and addressing difficult circumstances. And then I also began to realize that at the root of much of our chaos and issues and struggles, not just on the reservation, but beyond as well in mainstream society, was trauma. Unresolved trauma, intergenerational or personal and developmental trauma, intergenerational and historical trauma, the remnants of long-standing unresolved trauma. If you look back, if you follow that kind of understanding, you'll see the roots of unresolved trauma in just about every aspect of life, and certainly within myself as an individual. So I needed to understand that, and that got me onto a journey of addressing my own unresolved trauma, and again, I'll continue to do that for the rest of my life, and also understanding unresolved trauma writ large, if you will, how it shows up in society in general. And then all of those things, all of the trauma-informed practice, understanding trauma, anti-racism, anti-oppression, conflict resolution, understanding Indigenous rights, and that kind of thing, I think are the foundational understandings for cultural safety. Those are the kinds of things that we need to understand and embrace and engage. And I didn't know that that was my trajectory, but it seems to make sense to me that when we're talking about cultural safety, creating environments that are safe for Indigenous people, these are the things that we need to know about. And so that's what drives the work and how I do cultural safety work and how I work with my colleagues. So just to talk a little bit about the context, and again in the title, I just want to talk fairly briefly about what cultural safety is. And what I want to share with you now are some of the definitions that, I didn't mention who I work for. I work for Island Health right now on Vancouver Island, the health authority there, as a cultural safety facilitator. And I also do other work beyond Island Health as well. There's actually a really growing interest in cultural safety from many different sectors across civil society. The military is interested, the RCMP, and of course social work has been engaged with this for a long time. Corporate Canada as well, especially those organizations, those companies that work with Indigenous people, they're very interested in trying to figure out this relationship, because for the most part, they know that things are not going well. And they're starting to learn through things like the TRC that there's this long-standing impact of racist policies and negative interactions. So they're trying to grapple with this. So the definitions I want to share with you now come from Island Health, and I want to say this too, for your work with cultural safety, if that's what you're engaged with, know that these are definitions that come from our work. But you'll find that they vary as you go from organization to organization, or how people talk about it. And I really believe that that's because it needs to make sense for your environment, for the work that you're doing. So they need to be unique for you. They'll have some foundational concepts and understandings that kind of run throughout, but they also you need to make sure that they're based on your circumstances as well. So, and why we talk about cultural safety, we will often say it's for everybody, because when we talk about it, every ethnicity and every person says this, everybody should have this, and we totally agree. But we also recognize that the colonial history has had impacts on Indigenous people that put us at the top of the list as far as health disparities go. So for many health authorities across Canada, that's what they want to figure out. They want to change that. So that's why for us there's a focus on Indigenous cultural safety. And there's another reason why too, but I'll talk about that in a moment of why it's important to focus on Indigenous cultural safety for us. So this slide talks about that. And then we have some others too, and I won't go into them. We have like 4 main definitions of cultural safety. And they talk about things like it's about recognizing difference and working amongst that difference, respecting people and things like that. But one of the things I wanted to highlight about some of those other definitions, and I'll get to some that we really like, that talk about power power dynamics. And that's what's important to recognize in this too, and especially with Indigenous cultural safety, it's really important to trouble the power dynamics. And that's why things like racism become really important. If you can understand systemic racism, then you start to see how power and abuse of power works in those systems. And so that lends to your understanding of cultural safety and yourself, really. Because really cultural safety is about you and starting with yourself, looking within yourself to understand what makes you tick, what kind of traumas perhaps that you carry with you, how are you framed in this society, what kind of privileges do you carry, what kind of challenges do you have. All of those things we need to look inward to understand what makes us tick, because if the better we understand ourselves, the better we'll be at interacting with others. I wanted to bring this slide up too because I like this one. It's meaningful for me, especially as a male, somebody who's been socialized as a male in this society. I recognize that I'm sexist. There's no way that I can deny that. When I understand the system of sexism, I recognize that I have privileges, I participate, it's framed how I think about things. Now my job, since I know about that now and learning more about it, is to try to change that way of thinking and to change my patterns. But I like this one that talks all about feeling. Because for me as a guy, as a male in this society, I've been socialized to think that feeling is less than. That feeling is a sign of weakness. When I know and I've been taught, especially by my partner and my children, that feeling is strength, that vulnerability is strength, that humility is strength, connection to others and making sure that those connections are strong is strength, is so powerful in terms of how you walk in this world. So for me personally, I really like this one. And then the ones that I like, and I mentioned about power, I'm really thankful to the First Nations Health Authority and there's other partner agencies that I'll mention too. Certainly UBC and the Learning Circle I'm so thankful for this partnership. But this is their definition, and I really like it because it's talking about the ideal. This is the outcome that we're hoping to attain, and we're striving to be here. It's respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances inherent in the healthcare system. So that means we have to do work about understanding, so what are these power imbalances? So again, embracing anti-oppression or an understanding of systemic racism becomes really helpful in understanding that power imbalance, not only in the system, but how you participate in that as well. Those aren't easy things to do, so I want to recognize that too, that this isn't easy work, and it's not something that can be held only in your head. We have to feel it as well, and feel it in our whole being. It's not easy work. And so that's the hope, is that we can create these kind of environments like this. And then a second one that First Nations Health Authority has brought to us, and that we really like, is cultural humility. So it often is cultural safety is talked about at the same time as cultural humility. And I like it because it's the process. It's talking about, so how do you get there? And so we recognize that this is a lifelong journey of recognizing that there's so much that we need to learn, and there's so much that we need to undo, and it's going to take time, and we have to be patient with ourselves and with each other on this journey. But it's about, and so taking the time to reflect, and it's also understanding systemic biases. So what has these systems of oppression put into our own minds? So for myself as a male in the society, I recognize that it's placed things in my mind and patterns that I've normalized. So I need to trouble those and recognize that this isn't normal. This is inherent behavior, it's abuse of power, and so I need to take responsibility to change that within myself, and then see how I can change the system around me, to work with others to do that. So, and then humility again too is a lot of times what we do is that in my bio it talks about looking to Indigenous worldview. So a lot of times we'll think about these kinds of concepts, but from our Indigenous understandings, from our teachings, from language, that can add so much to these concepts. Because for most Indigenous languages throughout the world, it was a very conceptual language. English is very noun and verb based. It's very labeling. It's kind of static, if you will. For most Indigenous languages, they were very conceptual, and they provided movement, and they provided movement between individuals too. Like one word might mean something slightly different to me than it does to the rest of you, because of my experiences that I can put into that. Who told me that story adds to it, whether it was a loving grandmother or somebody like that. That adds to the story. So it becomes this living concept that moves, like almost like a moving picture or movie. Oftentimes a word will mean. So we try to add those into our understanding of things as well, and to recognize that there's movement and fluidity and adaptability in these kinds of understandings. And so I just want to say this too, that we recognize too the origins of cultural safety as a concept come from the Maori people, the Maori nurses specifically. So I'm very thankful for it's been almost 30 years now when they brought this forward. And it was Maori nursing students that first talked about that, when they recognized that they felt unsafe in their learning environments, in their universities and colleges, because they weren't being taught by people like them or from their concepts, and they felt unsafe. And so they brought that forward, and out of that came this concept of cultural safety, as well as practicing nurses that said there was something wrong with their healthcare facilities because their relatives, their Indigenous people, were coming to these facilities and being treated terribly, discriminated against, and because maybe they didn't speak English, they spoke their traditional languages, or they looked to their traditional ways to guide their life, and they were being ridiculed and treated badly for that. So out of that came this understanding of cultural safety. And then I also want to raise my hands to the amazing people of this part of the world, the Indigenous people that have been resistors for hundreds of years. And out of that resistance has arose accords and agreements and statements and efforts where allies have come on board, and they've really stood their ground on this. And so that's why a lot of powerful things like cultural safety have come out of British Columbia and this part of the world. So I'm very thankful for all of those things that we can stand on and look to guide our work. And then looking to Indigenous community, I'm not from this part of the world. I'm a guest where I live on Vancouver Island, so I need to look to the wisdom and to the direction of Indigenous people there to help shape and guide my work. And then the last thing is that we really tried to take a relational approach to this, because and I'll talk a little bit more about this, especially in terms of trauma-informed care, that if we talk about this in ways that are triggering, or that we don't create an environment where triggers can be held and worked with, then all we do is we trigger people, and then we're trying to say these things, but if people are triggered, they can't hear us. Right? So we have to figure out, so how do we do this in such a way that we create this environment where people can engage with these difficult concepts, this difficult history. Looking within is never easy. It's probably the hardest work that we have to do. So how do we create these environments and not do it in ways so that we don't trigger and make it all nice, but walk in such a way that we're walking beside each other and supporting one another so that we can engage in this work together. So we look to Indigenous, our teachings from Indigenous people and ourselves, that's what we bring to this work. And so there, again, the circle process becomes really important. It creates this environment where we can practice being human with one another and working together in relational ways. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about leadership. Just a really quick story. I was trying to think of a way to talk about leadership in a different way from an Indigenous perspective. And what came to mind was a story that a Haudenosaunee friend told me many years ago now. He talked about that there was this, back in Ontario, during the time of Oka and a lot of chaos and turmoil going on in their communities over there. And there was this news reporter that went to visit one of the leaders in the community, and they were talking about the issues, and the news reporter said to the leader, he said, why don't you just tell your people what to do? And the leader said, well, if I told my people what to do, I would no longer be the leader. And so it was about taking direction from the people. But there's something deeper to that as well, and that's the land. So the issue of why they were talking was because of the land, that Indigenous people were standing up for, this is our land and we don't want this to happen to our land. You haven't talked with us, you haven't consulted with us, this is inappropriate use of the land. And so there's that issue to it as well, and that's why you can't tell people what to do when they have a connection to the land that's based on their own sense of belonging to the land and their own sense of self. And so it would be ridiculous for a leader to say, well, you must do this because I'm the leader, so now I'm the owner of the land. It doesn't make sense from a Indigenous worldview that you have to incorporate the agency of that person, and that it's not your role to tell them what to do. In fact, it's your role to listen to them and to sort through what everybody is saying and to gather people in such a way that everybody can hear one another, so that leader can hear what is the direction that the people are asking here, and then how do I enact that. So that's one of the I think the differences in Western perhaps understandings of leadership, where we're talking now about elements of power. And it's not that power is wrong, it's how you use it and how you think about power and how you embrace it. Because later on I'll show you a slide that talks about the a popular definition or formula of systemic racism, and it talks about systemic abuse of power and racial prejudice equals racism. So we have to think about that. It's not that power is wrong. In fact, there's many Indigenous cultures throughout the world that were hierarchical, but they used power appropriately. They used their power appropriately, especially when they recognize that connection to the land and that everything is connected. So it would be a poor decision to do something based on your wanting something for yourself, when you know if you do that, it's going to affect everybody else, and in the long run, it's bad for you anyway. So you wouldn't, you knew that, so you wouldn't do it. And so that's why for Indigenous cultures that were hierarchical, they would work, because they recognize the difference in abuse of power and using power appropriately. So I'll just talk really briefly about the TRC. I'm assuming that many of us know about that history and the court case that came about when folks wanted to address the legacy and the unresolved trauma of the Indian residential school era, and then subsequently the 94 calls to action that came out of the summary report, that now all aspects of civil society can engage with these calls to action, because you can pretty much find yourself in the calls to action. If you look at them, they're addressed in two main focuses. One is looking at the legacy, making sure that we know the history, we're educated in knowing that this happened, and then what can you do to move forward? What kind of things do you need to embrace to change and to start to realize reconciliation, which in my opinion is going to take many years. And I think what's often missed too in the calls to action and in the whole TRC issue is that's just one aspect. The residential schools were just one thing that happened to Indigenous people. There's so many other things that we need to deal with and look at and to face the truth about. And we could talk for many hours about all of those aspects. So maybe that's all I'll say about the TRC, and then we can embrace that question that we had for you at the beginning. So I just want to talk a little bit about qualities, and certainly these are not the only qualities that I'm going to list here. And there's two main ones that I want to focus on. And the first one is talking about vulnerability. And maybe I'll start with telling the story that I really appreciate from Brené Brown. I'm sure many of you have heard of Brené Brown. She's a vulnerability researcher. And if you haven't had a chance to read her books or see some of her video clips, I really encourage you to do it, because she talks about the need for vulnerability. And I certainly had to learn that as a man in this society. And one of my primary learnings was when my partner for years was encouraging me to be more vulnerable with her and to share more deeply. And there came a time when I finally shared with her something I thought I would never share with her. And I shared it with her. And there were lots of tears and all of that thing, but I remember, and I'll never forget the feeling that I had when I finished talking. And it was so profound to me because I was coming from the understanding as a male that showing vulnerability was weakness. But in that moment, I felt powerful. I felt empowered. I felt grounded. I felt connected with my partner in a way that I'd never felt before, and that was strength to me. And so I think that's really important to recognize as a leader, is that vulnerability, your ability to be vulnerable and your ability to encourage vulnerability, is a really key skill in that. And so the story that Brené Brown tells that I like to tell too is. She was talking a few years ago, and this was during, she's from the US, she's from Texas, and she was talking about the time when Black Lives Matter was big in the news, and she said the biggest issue facing the US right now is racism. And more recently she issued another video and she said nothing has changed, that's still the biggest issue that they're facing. But she said we're not talking about it. And we're not having that deep dialogue around what this is. We're not exploring it deeply. We're running from it, in fact. And then based on her research and her understandings of vulnerability, she says it's because of shame. And the reason she says that is she says if you talk about racism and systemic racism, you eventually have to talk about privilege and white privilege. And that scares white people. And I know that as a man, when to talk about sexism, I have to talk about my privilege and those things that I've fallen into and embraced. I have to talk about those things and do something about it. And there is shame and guilt that comes with that. So she says that that's what blocks this deep dialogue, is that people don't want to go there. They don't want to look inward. And so, and she says that shame is held in place by three things: by silence. So you won't talk about it. You won't go to those places. You won't hear each other, or you'll shut people down. You'll dehumanize the other so that they're silenced, that you don't have to listen to their voices or their stories. Or secrets, that we won't, or that's the second thing, is secrets. And so that we don't learn about these stories. We don't learn about residential schools. We don't learn about the reserve system and where that comes from, that it's an apartheid policy. We don't talk about those things. They're secrets. We keep them secret. So there's silence, there's secrets, and then there's judgment. So those three things keep shame in place and guilt in place. And judgment are those narratives that we learn, that we're socialized to believe. When we see people that perhaps are struggling with addictions, we quickly have these stories that jump to our minds that says it's their fault, or that they're susceptible to alcohol or drugs. So we have these stories that quickly jump to mind that shut down that sense of there's something that we need to do here. Right, so that's the judgment piece of it. Silence, secrets, and judgment keep guilt and shame in place. And then she says that vulnerability is the antidote to shame. So if we can gather in these places to have these deep talks and to look inward and share and connect in that way, it becomes an antidote to shame. And that's where my story of the strength of it comes in. It's an antidote because you start to recognize the strength of that. And the really cool thing about that is that she goes on to say is that vulnerability is the gateway to innovation and creativity. So if we want to work together in different ways and in profound ways, then vulnerability becomes a key to that. And for me as an Indigenous person, circles become a really important place, because then you can create that environment where we start to learn how to be vulnerable, to share deeply, to listen in different ways. So it allows a place for us to actually practice being human with one another and being vulnerable. And that is strength. The second one is working from an analysis of oppression. This has become so important for me and my work. I sometimes think that people feel that perhaps I'm a broken record, because I talk about that we need to have an analysis of what's happening in society. What is this system of oppression? What is racism? What is systemic racism? Let's try to understand it. Let's try to figure out where it came from. Why did it come into being? And then how does it enact itself? How does it operate? Let's understand that, and it's really key not only for us to do that as individuals, but if you're a leader of an organization, or you're an organization yourself, or a team, to understand it together so that you have common language and common understanding really helps your efforts moving forward. Because if you say a phrase that you've learned from an analysis, like divide and conquer, things like that, then you all know what's going on, and because you've worked through an analysis together. It's things like that become really helpful for a team, and especially for a leader to embrace and to encourage in their working environment, to work from an analysis. And so that's why for me, anti-racism becomes really important, rather than being fearful of the word racism, which we are, and that goes back to that shame and guilt thing. Let's try to embrace it. Let's figure out how we can embrace it, so that we can address it. Let's have that deep dialogue around racism, and then let's work together to figure out creative and innovative ways to deal with it. So those are two key qualities, and so this is where I want to talk just really briefly about systemic racism, and simply put by some of the people that have engaged with this work for many, many years, like Joe Fagan. Simply put, it's deeply rooted racism in all levels of society. And then I talked about the definition. A popular definition of racism is race prejudice and systemic abuse of power equals racism. So that's why it's really important to engage with the power conversation and understanding of power and how it's abused. And you can see it in things like the residential school era and the policies that came about, very racist, or the Indian Act that's based on understandings of inferior others. Right, and that's based in racist ideology. And then we like with our work with Island Health, I really appreciate the work of Dr. Bruno St Denis. If you get a chance to read some of her stuff and see some of her webinars, she talks about a culturally safe or anti-racist approach versus a culturally responsive one. So she's talking there about only looking to the culture to learn about the other, looking to Indigenous culture to learn and to figure out a way forward. What she says, I really like how she frames it. She says, that kind of approach hasn't had the effect that they had hoped for all these years. It's not having the impact that we want. And so for us, what we try to think about it in that let's take a step back before we engage with the culture, to learn about the power dynamics, to learn about the system of oppression, and figure out how that's impacted us. Because for a lot of people, when they hear these powerful stories from the culture, or they're learning from the culture, it's really hard to hear it when you've got all of this other noise going on inside of you that you probably don't even understand around, and some people call it white noise if you're a person that's racialized as white. All of these stories, all of the judgments, all of those things going on for you because you haven't had the opportunity to trouble them and to change those patterns, then you don't hear the culture in the way that it's meant to be heard. So we really we feel that cultural safety is taking that step back and learning about the environment first, the systemic oppressive environment first, and finding yourself in that, locating yourself in that environment, and figuring out the stuff that you need to work on, and then it's much more profound to learn from Indigenous culture after that. And then some other ones that I wanted to list as well were trauma-informed practice. I talked a little bit about that. And the motto for trauma-informed practice if you get an opportunity to learn about trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed care, I really encourage you to do that, because the motto for trauma-informed care or practice is rather than saying something is wrong with somebody, especially for healthcare providers, when you have clients that are coming to you in a state, if you will, rather than saying, well, something is wrong with them, ask what's happened to them. So you begin to look at their history of what brought them to this moment. So it's a different approach than trying to fix the problem or to say you can't be that way here and shun people for that, is to try to understand, so what brought you to this moment of being this way in this moment. And it becomes really important because we apply the trauma-informed practice model not only to individuals, but also to the system around us. So for us, it's about, rather than saying that something is wrong with the system, with this abusive system, but to ask, so what happened? How did this system become this way? So that's why understanding trauma and historical trauma becomes really important. In fact, in our work with Island Health, when we talk about this, we talk about what we call the older story of colonization. So we talk about the impacts of the last 500 years on Indigenous people and how it shows up in the health care or in their health and well-being. But then we also say, then we apply that trauma-informed practice model to say, so what happened 500 years ago? Was something wrong with European nations when they came this way, or do we leave it there? So we choose to apply that motto to that story to say, so what happened to European people? And so we jump back 1,000 years ago and start to look at the history of Europe, and you start to recognize that there's a pattern, there's a cycle here. There were indigenous people of Europe that were being colonized 1,000 years ago. And so out of that unresolved trauma comes this cycle of the colonized became the colonizer. And then we start talking also about things to show how that then gets put into place and how it becomes normalized. We talk about things like the doctrine of discovery, how power was abused and put into in a systemic way that still lingers to this day. We talk about and these are secrets, because usually what I do at this point, I ask people, how many have heard in this room or online, how many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery? And maybe just show your hands, how many have heard of it? Just like 4 or 5, and I have to say, 4 or 5 years ago when I'd ask this question, oftentimes no hands would go up. So I'm glad to see that more and more people are learning about it, because it's becoming more and more important. The TRC mentions, the calls to action mention the doctrine of discovery, that it's important to remember this. So basically it's how colonization, modern day colonization, the last 500 years or even more, came into being and why it's so powerful. And if you look at it, you'll see that in the 14th century, a series of papal bulls that were issued by the Catholic Church, because they were the ones in power in that time, that they started to issue these papal bulls that became the legal and the moral apparatus that allows for modern day colonization. So it issued things like, as the explorers went out and they encountered new lands, they had a problem. They ran into people. So how can you claim this land when there's all of these people here? So they went back and talked to the leaders, and the popes issued a papal bull that said, if you encounter people and they're not Christians and you don't recognize their form of government, then they're not fully human. And so then that frees the mind from the moral dilemma of what you're going to do to these people, right? And so that's one of the bulls, and there was a series of other ones. One divvied up the land. Like, there's a reason why Portuguese is spoken in the far south and Spanish a little further north and French and that kind of thing, because they actually divvied up the land between the colonial powers of the day. So it's things like that we don't know about, and yet that's the basis for North America, for Western civilization in this part of the world. That's the basis for it, but we don't know a lot about it. So I'm glad to see that more and more people are starting to understand it. But those are the kinds of things we need to know about when we look back and say, we need to understand what happened here, when we take that trauma-informed practice approach to this work. And so a leader needs to not only understand that from working with individuals, but for understanding the system as well. And then relational practice, I talked about that already. I won't say too much more. It's so important to remember that You know, we all carry unresolved trauma, and we all have had things that have happened to us, and so to figure out a way of being with one another that where we can actually work together on some of those things or keep those things in mind becomes really important. And maybe what I'll say about this, the relational practice, what we're learning is that's really important in all of this is to remember that it's not an either or situation, it's a both and. How do we think about these things with a broader understanding so that we're not falling into patterns of ostracizing people, but trying to understand them, and so taking a both and approach becomes really important in doing this work. And value-based, and we talk about this too, and actually cultural humility for us was really key because it's talking about a universal value. And when we conduct our circles, we talk about the values that drive the circle. So we talk about things like respect, and we talk about things like humility and integrity and generosity and courage and compassion and fortitude. And those are just the ones that we use, the seven values. But there's others too, but they're universal. These are values that we all hope to walk with. So we talk about those as what drives our way of being with one another. So very much value-based. And you can find values in, most organizations have a set of values. And you can often find, they can be powerful. You can put life into those values that sometimes we just put on a poster and slap up on a wall somewhere, and then we forget about these values. But if we can make them come to life, and for us what we do is we apply an Indigenous understanding to the values, and so we deepen them, and we bring in that kind of conceptual understanding based on language and teachings and that kind of thing to expand these values in a different way. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about today was paying attention to the neurobiology for creating the environment for change. So, when somebody is traumatized and it goes unresolved in their mind, and this is kind of talking about when somebody is triggered. So what's happening to that person is that they are being reminded of that trauma that they experienced. And if it's unresolved, that means it's stuck on one side of your brain, right? The hippocampus and the amygdala hasn't had the ability to incorporate that into the reasoning side of your brain. So when something happens that has you recognizing that, or feels like that traumatic experience, then all of those chemicals that happen to you when you experience that trauma start to course through you again. And so you can't hear, you're in fight, flight, or freeze. And so it's really important to pay attention to those kinds of dynamics because we need to figure out, so then how do we trick our brain into incorporating the other side of the brain so that we can say, when we're reminded of those traumas, we can say, that reminds me of that experience, but it's not happening. And so then it's coming to the other side of the brain, you're putting reasoning to it. And so yes, it's still there, and yes, it was a terrible thing, but it's not happening now. I can stay centered, I can be present in the room, I can hear and be a part of the conversations or a part of these efforts in a full way, in a holistic way. So very important to recognize and to learn from that part of the field of science, and medicine is growing amazingly, and so we can learn a lot from what's going on in the brain from more recent studies and research that's being done. So I just wanted to list just a few things that happen to your brain when it's being suggested to you for change. So we're going back to the title now of creating a change environment. Because we're asking people to walk in a different way now, right? So we're suggesting to them a different way. And sometimes what happens is it's the approach that we take to suggesting to our team, to our organization that change needs to happen, that actually builds up strong resistance to it, even if it's a really good idea. It's because the brain recognizes, and this happens when change is suggested, it's actually painful for us because we get so used to operating in a certain way, and we're using a part of the brain that doesn't take as much energy, but we're actually asking people to incorporate a different part of the brain that takes a lot of energy, and our bodies want efficiency. So it's going to resist using more energy, that part of the brain that requires more energy. So it's actually even more, it's painful for us to think about doing things in a different way, even if we know that it's a better way. Our brains will tell us to resist it. And so what we're actually doing is when we're asking people to incorporate this out of the part of the brain, it's near the part that triggers fear and fight, flight, or freeze. So oftentimes that's why there's so much resistance that comes into when we suggest to an organization or to people that change needs to happen, we're triggering them into fight, flight, or freeze. So the transition doesn't happen smoothly because there's resistance, or people just, they freeze, and so then they don't move on what you're hoping they'll move on. So thinking about these things become really important for a leader and how we go about talking about change. And so we're learning more and more now about the carrot and the stick, that doesn't actually work. There's Dr. Sandy Pentland, he's written books, Social Physics, I think is one of his books, and he's done studies. He's out of MIT. They've been able to do research on people now to recognize that the carrot and stick isn't nearly as strong as if you see a peer that's doing the change, somebody you trust and that you like. If they're doing the change, you're more apt to do the change, and then even if that person goes, you'll still do the change because you've trusted. It helps to alleviate that fight, fight, or freeze part of your brain, right? Because there's somebody you trust and you like. And so then you do the change and you realize it's good, and then you keep on doing it. So the carrot and the stick doesn't really work. It might work for the time being while the carrot is there or while you're being hit by the stick. You'll do it then, but then as soon as those things are gone, you'll stop doing it. And humanism or empathy is good. So listening to, because this is kind of the opposite of the carrot and the stick, is to listen really carefully and have empathy for the person, and that's good. But it's not enough just to think about it as an individual. I think what they're learning here is that it has to be a community process. We have to connect with one another in these stories that require empathy. We need to have those kinds of connections that can actually help to change your own story. Because oftentimes trauma gets, you'll hear somebody that's living with unresolved trauma often tell the same story over and over again about that traumatic experience because it's stuck there, right? But if you start to be able to hear others who carry the same story, and then maybe somebody says, so yeah, I walk with that, but here's how I've learned how to be different with that story or to embrace that story in a different way. It can help to change the story of somebody else because they say, oh, well, you did that, so then maybe I can try that. So empathy is important, but I think it needs to be done in an environment where we're all kind of working at this together and building those connections. And then focus on power, or focus is power, sorry. Focus is power. So how do we have to have this sustained, because it takes the brain a while before neural pathways are changed. So you have to be able to do this. And so I like to tell this story of our work. We built a couple new hospitals on the island over the last couple of years, and one of the things that we were asked to do as cultural safety facilitators was to train before the hospitals opened, they wanted all the staff trained in cultural safety, and that was thousands of people, and there was 2 of us, and we knew we couldn't do it. And the main reason why I was getting stuck with it, because I was thinking, okay, so I have to do workshops for these people. They have to take online courses, and they have to do workshops face-to-face with me. And so that's a lot of organizing, and that's a lot of time to get people through this. So I talked with our learning and education program at Island Health, and I asked them, what's your model of education? What's your philosophy behind what you do? And they said, well, we use the 70-20-10 model. And so, and it's talking about percentage, 70-20-10, so it equals 100%. So they say that any new learning on anything, a piece of equipment or a big concept like cultural safety, 10% of it should be formal learning. So online courses or workshops, only 10%. And when I heard that, I breathed a huge sigh of relief because I was only on the hook for 10% of this, because that's kind of what I do. 70% is what is in your purview every day on the job that reminds you of this new learning. What's around you? 70%. What can you look to, whether it's on something online or a poster or some other creative way of always remembering this is the new learning and this is what we need to be doing. This is how we do it. 70%. And that's stuff that people in that department need to develop themselves because they know what works in their department the best. So that's work that folks need to do based on who they are in their work. And 20% is with coaches and mentors. Who gets it? Who's doing it already? And how can we look to them to guide us? And how can they help to assess us, to let us know what we need to work on? So again, it's a very relational thing then to look to another who's actually doing this work. So that's focus is power. It requires us to keep at it because that's what changes the neural pathways in our brains. And then expectations shape reality. Again, more and more research is showing that the narratives that we have, that's what shapes our way of being. And not only about the other, also about ourselves. So if we haven't troubled the concept or the reality of internalized oppression or oppression as a system and how it's impacted us, so I'm thinking about myself here as an Indigenous person, there's stories that I've learned about myself that are based on garbage that come from an oppressive system that says that you're inferior, you're less than, your culture is primitive. All of those stories that go through your head that we've learned from society go on. So if you haven't, so those become expectations in your own life or of the other. If you see somebody and you have all these stories that come forward because of just the way the person looks, then that will shape your expectation of them as well. So we have to be able to trouble those kinds of things and recognize what's going on in our brains when we have those kinds of expectations. And then the last one is attention density shapes identity. So this is about the change. So if we can keep at it, if we can keep that focus on what we need to be doing differently, our brains are amazing. They'll adapt to that. And we'll actually learn and we'll actually normalize that behavior because we've normalized oppressive behavior. It's just, oftentimes we hear, well, that's just the way it is. It's because that's been normalized in our heads, but our brains are amazing. We can create different neural pathways, and we can normalize the way we see ourselves and the way we see our world in a way that's less oppressive and that's powerful in being together in creative and innovative ways. So I think, I'm just going to leave you with this quote that I love this quote. My colleague Yvette Ringham-Cowan, when we first started doing this work with Island Health, she suggested that this was a really important quote to use in our work. And it comes from an activist group in Australia, and it's often attributed to Lila Watson. But if you look at what she says about it, she says it came out of a collective. She voiced it during a speech, but she said it came out of a collective. And we really like to say that to recognize that it wasn't about an individual, it was about people working together. And it says, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So this work of cultural safety and being a leader in it isn't about helping Indigenous people. It's about recognizing that we're all in this system that's been abusive to, especially it shows up in Indigenous people, but we're all a part of it and we all need liberation from it. And we all need to change the way that we think and embrace this work. And it requires us all to be leaders in this work. And certainly to look for those leaders that are operating in this way. So that's all I'm going to say for now. I know I've said a lot. Thank you for listening. And I'll leave the questions up here now for us to embrace if you choose to embrace this question, or perhaps you have another question to ask.
Yeah, we'll just give us a moment. I just want to address a question that came online from one of our participants. Jessica was wondering if you had any good examples of healthcare organizations or others that have implemented a lot of what we talked about today successfully that we could kind of look towards as examples perhaps,
Right.
or something that we could kind of guide our work.
Yeah, well, it's a journey, and I really appreciate the work that I've been able to this journey of working with Island Health, and Island Health has a long way to go. You know, and I think all my colleagues there would fully agree with that. We've learned a lot in the last 4 years since we've initiated people like myself and my colleagues that our sole purpose is to work at cultural safety. We're not doing this off the side of our desk. This is our sole purpose, is to train and to help people understand what cultural safety is. And we've learned a lot, and we've also stumbled a lot, and we've had difficult experiences, but we've also learned a whole lot, and there's been some amazing things. So I would say from my perspective, and I don't want to sound like I'm tooting our own horn, but that's been my experience. And there's other organizations, and I'm not feeling so comfortable to name them yet, but
Sure.
but ones that have recognized that they have a history of engagement with Indigenous people, and they can admit that it hasn't been good. Those are the ones that I think are ripe for change, because they're able to admit that, yeah, you'd think we'd know better, but we've done some terrible things, and we don't have good relationships with Indigenous people. And so then now they're looking to cultural safety to help guide their work of looking inward first, of troubling that mindset that we carry when we're raised in the society, and the things have been kept to us, the secrets have been kept from us, and we haven't heard each other, we haven't heard Indigenous people tell their stories and tell their experiences, or we don't know about things like the doctrine of discovery, and we so quickly fall into those patterns of judgment that are implanted in our minds. So I'm actually quite hopeful in this work when I see people engaging in the ways that I see, like organizations like Island Health that are striving to do this, and others that are incorporating this kind of thinking.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Harley. So just to summarize there, Island Health would be a good one, but not to name names. Any organization that kind of starts out with first accepting their position in the colonial history of, like, let's say this country, but the Americas in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay. Awesome. What things can employers do to help facilitate change and encourage cultural safety in urban settings as like an example? Do you have an example? What
organizations can do
to help facilitate that change?
Right. Well, I think this is where leaders play a big role. And it goes back to that 70-20-10 also. If your leader is a part of that 20%, right, and they're enacting some of those other things I talked about, like being relational with and being vulnerable, that's a powerful thing when your leader can create an environment where you can be real with them and they can be real with you. And I think we fall into this pattern of hierarchical power where we feel it's not professional to be vulnerable. But if we can change that mindset to recognize the strength of that, and I'm not talking about the falling apart kind of things that we can do when we're living with unresolved trauma. I'm talking about when we're doing our work, when we're actually doing our healing work, and then we can talk about it and we can share those deep stories that perhaps we wouldn't have shared because we haven't been able to put reason to them by incorporating the other side of the brain. Because that's when you can talk about them, is when you've actually done your work on healing, right? Because then you can articulate it. So that's where I think leaders that can encourage folks to be that way with one another. And this might sound really simple, but one of the things that I think has changed some organizations is incorporating the circle process for engaging with your staff. And a lot of times the first kind of response to that is, well, we don't have time. But actually, if you can engage with your staff in this way that's more wholesome and fulsome, you actually become more efficient. Because you're dealing with things up front, you're dealing with kind of the root of things, because you learn how to explore the root. You don't just focus on the problem or it's like that trauma-informed practice thing, that what's happened. You start to dig at the roots of this. And so you become more efficient in the way that you do your work. So taking the time up front to use the circle process makes you a much more efficient organization. And there's other groups that are doing some of that kind of work. There's a group that talks about mindset, and they talk about that, where if you can change the mindset of your staff, you actually become less costly and more efficient, because you're not always putting out fires and you're not always stuck at stage one, because you're able to go deeper with things. So it's a very efficient way of change. So I would encourage organizations to learn how to facilitate circles and incorporate them in their work.
Awesome. Great.
Sure. Several questions, but I'll try and zero in. I guess the first thing that comes up is wishing we were in circle, because then it would be easier to connect with everyone. The second was that when our organization met in circle, what was the greatest vulnerability was not having a table between us, right? Like, we often think we're in a boardroom and we're in a circle. We're not.
Yeah.
But my question is, so much wisdom outlined there, and it's reams and years of work, to actually engage in a conversation regarding racism and white privilege, and to do so in a way that doesn't trigger the guilt, shame reaction of, what are you calling me, a racist? You know, which really shortens the conversation quite a bit. That I'm uncomfortable going there, and I'd like to, if you have any, I don't know, ideas or ways that you've been able to engage in those conversations that isn't as,
Yeah.
I'll just reiterate that question quickly for the online audience so they know what we're talking about. So the question was about kind of going about these questions of engaging in difficult conversations, about addressing everything that we've talked about today. How do we go about that in a way that doesn't make the person immediately throw up barriers or change the shift of the conversation into I'm not a racist or something like that? And the question was, do we have any tips or ideas as to how to facilitate those types of conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know for myself, when I started on this journey of trying to understand racism, I found myself falling into patterns that I had learned of what it means to be Indigenous or a person of color in a racialized system. So what I mean is that I found myself trying to make white folks comfortable. And by saying, oh, no, it's not, there isn't this thing about racism, it's just the few bad apples, that it's just some people being nasty and things like that. But it took other folks that had been on this journey for a while to walk alongside me to help me understand what was going on inside of myself. And it took my partner, who's non-Indigenous, of us figuring this out together, and at the same time as me being male in this society and falling into my patterns of sexism with a woman who was saying, no, I won't have that. And so I had to figure that out, because I had this relationship that was meaningful to me. And I think that's where when I talked about how we'll actually do change when we see somebody we trust and appreciate doing the change themselves. It's not that it's not comfortable. It's not that it's not uncomfortable to still do the change. It's that we have somebody that we trust, that we will lean towards. And so that's what I think it takes for us when these feelings of uncomfortableness come up, because it is uncomfortable, and I think we have to become comfortable with the uncomfortable, knowing that that's a part of the journey as well. But then it also becomes about how do we learn to deal with trauma and recognize our own stuff, so then we develop this pattern of saying, yes, I'm uncomfortable with this conversation, but it's okay. I can walk with this because I have others that have been on this journey, and I'm learning to trust myself, and I know this will be good for me. And that's why the circle becomes really important too, because it helps you practice those kinds of things. It helps you practice being uncomfortable. Oftentimes in our circles when we facilitate them, we talk about at the beginning kind of guidelines. We plant some seeds for people of how to engage with this conversation in a different way. One of them is that we ask people to, two things. One is resist the urge to fix. So when somebody says something that it makes you uncomfortable and you don't agree with it, resist that urge to fix it. And then to ask yourself, what is it about me that has me reacting to that story? And it's a really good practice of learning self-reflection and learning what makes you tick. And so as you start to notice these patterns within yourself, it gives you direction on what you need to work on. Then it also develops this pattern of trusting yourself, of listening to yourself. Because so many times we talk in such a way that, and it's not us, it's somebody else that's told us to think that way. And so we start to learn to find your authentic self in the circle and trusting those kinds of things as you uncover all of those things that are covering up your authentic self, all of those narratives, all of those stories, or perhaps past hurts and things like that, or the shame and the guilt of having this conversation, of recognizing that you carry privilege in this society. All of those kinds of things can begin to happen, but it takes time and it takes practice. So I hope that answers the question. And can I you had talked at the break about an online question, and it's so connected with this too. Maybe
Sure.
you can read it.
Yeah, we can go there and then we'll go back to
then
the live audience. So the question was from Megan Black. When you don't have mentors or examples of success, can something else substitute for that 70-20-10 rule that we had talked about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what came to mind when I heard that was these systems of oppression, what they end up doing is creating walls. And so that we create these walls even within ourselves that we don't, like for myself as a male, I didn't want to access the feeling part of me because this wall had been created by this system of oppression that told me this lie that that's not good. But there was this wall there and it still needs to come down. It's starting to come down inside of me, but it still needs more work. But that's what happens too in the larger society, is that we create these walls around each other that we've got it all figured out. The society has told us what to believe about the other. So we have these walls. And that creates loneliness. And so what we have found, and in terms of this question of when you don't have these folks around you what I'd like to say is that sometimes they're there, but we haven't had the opportunity to be that way with one another. And so what we've found in our work, working with health professionals and health service providers, is that sometimes we'll have a department that comes together, and one of the first things we do is a circle. And we ask some poignant questions. And what happens is that as people start to share, you can almost see people looking at each other in a different way, because they might have worked together for 10 years or more, but they don't know each other because the environment has created these walls where they don't have time to get to know one another, or they only have seen the worst of each other. But the circle starts to help people to see each other in a different light, and it starts to break down a little bit that loneliness that we feel in these systems of oppression that keep us apart from one another. And we start to blur the lines of between us. And then trauma-informed practice, if you delve into that, they talk about that too, that it's for that work, it's less about building bridges, but more about blurring the lines that keep us divided. So it's about being kind of in the moment and interacting in that way of being, of trying to look what's happened, so there isn't this formal bridge to the other person, but you start to blur the lines, and a lot of times you start to realize, oh, I've had that experience too, or they're just like me, or they remind me of somebody, so then the lines start to blur. And so I don't want to sound flippant about the question, but sometimes the people are actually there, but the environment and the system hasn't allowed us to connect in that way. So I would say that maybe they're there,
Yeah.
but we just don't have the opportunity to connect in that way.
And that first step would be obviously to try to find or to build an environment that would stimulate that connection amongst each
Yeah,
other.
yeah, and then the last thing I'll say about this, and it's connected to the question that was here earlier, we call this process of how to engage with somebody who perhaps you recognize isn't on the journey yet, and maybe you are on the journey. And it comes from the cultural humility aspect of all of this, of recognizing your own biases and your own patterns, and recognizing that you're a lifelong learner. So we call it coming alongside somebody. Because we often ask the question, you know, have you ever encountered somebody that's said some terribly racist or sexist things, and then you confront them? And so a lot of people will say, yeah, I've done that, and then we'll ask the question, how has that gone? And most people will say it was terrible. It drove us further apart. It turned into a big fight. I was so triggered I just had to leave, or they just left, and pretty soon there were sides, and it's a terrible thing. So we talk about coming alongside, that if you can talk to a person, because a lot of times when they say those things, they're saying it from a triggered place. They're saying it from a standpoint of usually fight, right? Or flight, like just stay away from me. I'm going to put this big wall up here so you don't get any closer to me. So if you can find a way of coming alongside them, and by that, and this is where cultural humility comes in, is by recognizing the privileges and the impacts on you as an individual that you've carried, but you're working on now, to be able to say to that person something like, you know, I used to believe exactly like you. I've said the words that you've said, but I've learned some things, and here's what I've learned. So by showing that you're actually with that person, you're alongside them, they're more apt to turn to you and listen to you than fight you. And then you have their ear. And then you can start to help them understand. And more often than not, those conversations go totally differently. They become curious, and you can point them to things that you've learned. And so sometimes that's what can happen in situations where you feel that you're alone in an organization, is that you can figure out how can you have those alongside conversations with somebody. And you might be pleasantly surprised that they've been thinking about this too, or that you can start to nudge somebody along to start journeying with you, and pretty soon there's two. And then if you can do it with another person, there's three, you know, and then it starts to multiply like that.
Great. Thank you, Harley. Questions? Questions, anyone? Yeah.
Time.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
One last question. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, and I really connected to a lot of your messages, and in particular, the concept and the dialogue around humility is something that I've really been trying to promote within my own discipline, which is forestry. And I just find it really tough, I'm sure it's not just UBC, but it's an academic institution that's run on a business model. And I just find it really challenging when we're told what are we best at by the president of UBC as a task for everyone to identify. What are we best at so we can promote that? How do we overcome that kind of direction and leadership? I'm not saying that Santa Ono is against humility or being humble, but I think that this is the instruction that we're given, is to identify those aspects that that we are best, not just that we are good or could do better. What are we best at? And the humility, I think, it's so powerful. That self-reflection is incredibly important, and I just don't know what the long game is. I know this is a long journey, but I can't quite see the vision to valuing other things besides publications and degrees and things like that. The lived experience. Yeah. We would see a lot more Indigenous scholars, I think, if we value that a lot more than we currently do.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to paraphrase that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and correct me please if I'm wrong here. I think the final question of the day was, if there's someone in the system that you're working in, or the institution or whatever that's above you, that's perhaps implemented something that you don't agree with, or that you think that is counteracting the process or your learning journey in terms of being culturally, having cultural humility in this journey of cultural safety, how can you overcome that? Or how is there a way that you can kind of circumnavigate that? Am I getting at the gist of the question?
Yeah. So
More or less.
also kind of a rant. So
I actually didn't hear a question in that, but I certainly heard feeling
Yeah.
and values behind what you said, and that was powerful. And what I would say to this, and I was actually thinking about this on the way here, like what's been some of the most valuable parts of my journey? It's connecting with others and talking through, having that ability to not just rant. But ranting is important. Don't get me wrong. I rant, but it's also about finding a different way of having that conversation where you're starting to explore the creativity and the innovation of so what could we do about this, and hearing from one another. And I'm not giving this enough. I'm not finding the words to say that the importance of connecting with others and being able to talk authentically with one another becomes really important in all this. And it goes back to those silos that the systems create within us. I don't think we've learned how to connect with one another in meaningful ways. And maybe the last thing I'll say about this, the three most meaningful people in my life that I talk with are my partner and my two daughters. I have an older daughter as well, but my two youngest are with us. And the profoundness of our conversations, like they get this stuff. They get it. They don't talk about it from an academic level, but they talk about it from an authentic young person, what they see going on in the world. And they've taught me so much, and I just really encourage us all to look to those places where academia really hasn't had the opportunity to learn some of these deep things that we're talking about here, right? It's silenced those important voices, because that's academia came out of a system of unresolved trauma and oppression, right? And it made it into a hierarchy and a commodity. Knowledge and wisdom and connection with one another became a commodity and a way of hoarding power, right? It came out of a survival way of thinking of unresolved trauma. So it's maybe it's not necessarily the place for us to learn these things, but if we can find those places to learn these things and then influence academia, then I think there's tremendous hope.
Great, thank you. So we're running a little bit over time. We're going to have to cut the rest of the discussion short. I just wanted to give a big thank you, Harley. Thank you very much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us in person and with the online audience. I really appreciated it. Thank you again to our staff and to the CTLT for making this possible. I think, and for the FNHA for making this conversation possible. And finally, again, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you everyone that participated online. We hope that this conversation was illuminating. I found it fantastic, and I appreciate it very much, Harley. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So until next time, take care.